ones. We're glad to have everybody here. We're going to be focusing on tomato production here today. And if by the end of this half hour or so we have scared the dickens out of you about growing tomatoes, we probably have been successful. So in all honesty, tomatoes are very challenging to grow, especially the further south you go in this region. I think that Central Florida and South Florida. And as I go through here, you'll kind of see why. But there's a lot of challenges that are involved with growing tomatoes. And I think Wanda and I feel like we've talked more people out of growing tomatoes than we have talked to them into growing tomatoes, just because there's a lot of pieces and parts that make it really difficult. So we're going to get started here. And Hydroponics 101, there's a number of different things that we want to cover here today in the lesson. We talk a little bit about choosing the kinds of tomatoes that you might want to grow, the structures and systems that are going to be used, common greenhouse pests, understanding some of the substrates that are used, and mostly we want to focus on how to manage the crop, and then some practical considerations that are related to growing. It used to be back a few decades ago that when we talked about greenhouse to hydroponic tomatoes, you were really just talking about standard beefsteak types of tomatoes, large slicing types of tomatoes back in up until maybe around the late 1990s or so. We started to get into a little bit more diversification of types of tomatoes. But it used to be that the standard beefsteak would be one where the calyx was left on the tomato and packaged in a one-layer box. Then we began to see a little bit of the tomatoes on the vine, or sometimes referred to as cluster harvest tomatoes. And that's the lower picture here on the right-hand side would be more typical of a cluster harvest type. And the Canadians in particular went really big with the cluster harvest types of tomatoes around the turn of the century. So we began to diversify a little bit. And then I would say over the last 15 or 20 years, we've diversified even that much more, especially for local market types of situations where you go from cocktail types to the little tomato berries that are in that upper middle picture here, really, really, really high flavor types of tomatoes, other kinds, cherries and heirlooms. So today, the tomato picture is much different than what it used to be 30 years ago when we just had beefsteak. Now we've got all kinds of other types of tomatoes. I would say, just sort of as a caution, that most of these other types, in comparison to a beefsteak or cluster harvest or tomatoes on the vine, these other types that you see on the screen here are likely to be much lower yielding overall, and therefore there's going to have to be a much higher price than it would be for the beefsteaks or the tomatoes on the vine. But nonetheless, the picture of tomatoes has changed dramatically over time. In terms of structures, the further north you go in this region, where we are here in North Florida, and certainly north of here, if you're going to grow tomatoes through the winter time, you're going to need to have a type of structure that's going to be able to accommodate heating. You really don't want to let the temperature go down much below 60 or 62 degrees Fahrenheit at night. And so if you're in an area where it's going to go down to 40 or 50 degrees, even though the tomatoes don't die, they just as well die, because it really slows them down and the production really is diminished. In the wintertime also, we want as much light into the greenhouse as we possibly can. We have an advantage in the south in the sense that the temperatures are a little bit warmer and we don't have quite the heating costs that there would be in the northern climates and up in Canada. However, we do have some disadvantages, and the disadvantage primarily is that we're in a relatively low light period of time. The days are shorter, which everybody is kind of prepared for. But the other thing is that we have a lot of dew and condensation and fog in those winter months of December, January, and early February, which can really reduce the light. So our yields might go from 2 or 2.5 pounds per plant per week down to a half a pound per plant per week, something like that in the middle of the winter season. So if you have a type of structure like the upper left-hand side, a Cravo system that has a sort of an opening and closing type of cover to it, If you look at that, I can almost see, even though it's a still shot, I can still see whiteflies dive bombing in from if you were in South Florida in a high population. So we have some unusual situations. But if you have a lot of insects, keep in mind that they're going to be able to come into that kind of a structure. So you can grow them in high tunnels. You can grow them under open shade in the summertime. You can grow them with either passive ventilation or fan and pad types of situations. And I think that's mostly the detail of that is for another topic for another day. But just to say that making a decision of what type of structure you're going to use is really, really important and will vary from operation to operation or from school to school or from state to state. You could choose any one of these and be wrong, and you can choose any one of those and be right, depending on what it is that you're trying to accomplish in relation to tomatoes. I put some pest things in here. I'm not going to go through all of this, all of these, but I am going to just use as an example here for whiteflies, and specifically we're talking about silverleaf whitefly, which transmits a number of different viruses to tomatoes, and thrips, which also can be a problem for quality and also a vector of tomato spotted wilt. But I don't want to not mention that these other ones, aphids, spider mites, broad mites, can all be challenges as well. So I want here just briefly to paint the picture that there are some really serious pests that oftentimes are not, I'm not to say take for granted, but I think the reality is sometimes not fully understood. So I think of growing greenhouse tomatoes where you have those insects and the potential of the risk of transmitting vectored viruses from something like silverleaf whitefly, that you need to think of the greenhouse more like a fortress. And in this picture, we've screened in. This is a commercial operation where we were doing some trial work, and we've got an insect screening cover or room on the back end of the cool pad. And then we've also put a second layer in here of this metallized or reflective mulch outside of that intake end of the wall. And this reflective mulch is something that confuses flying insects like whiteflies or thrips. So when they fly over this type of a reflective mulch, they get basically confused because they don't know which is the real sun. They get disoriented because the reflection of the sun into the mulch confuses them and sort of jams their gears to be able to find the right direction. So there's some things that we can do to help minimize insect infiltration, but if you leave things relatively open, I would say that you are asking for trouble with things like whiteflies and thrips. The screening material just put up here that depending on what it is that you're trying to screen out, you have to have a pretty tight screen to keep out things like thrips. 192 microns is the size of the opening for making sure that we can screen out thrips. So in this picture, we have actually a thrips exclusion type of screen with a whitefly on there, and you can see how tight this weave is to keep things like thrips out, because thrips are narrow and bullet shape and can go through a very, very small opening. So depending on what it is that you're trying to do, you might be further north and have less concern about silverleaf whitefly. Congratulations if that's the case. And you can determine what tightness of weave of insect screening material you would use depending on what it is that you're after. Keep in mind, anytime that you add an insect screening material on there, it's going to reduce airflow. And so you've got to take that into consideration and make sure that you increase the surface area of that screened room to be able to make sure that we're not pulling too much weight or too much stress on the fans at the other end. This is a picture of what whitefly populations can look like if you totally ignore them. Even inside a high tunnel that's open, you can build really, really high populations. And so I would say if you saw something like this, or if somebody sent me this picture, I would just say close the door and be done, because at least in our area with the vectoring of the viruses, that's a really tough situation. And then this also plays into sort of a philosophical approach for a grower that might want to think about eliminating the use of pesticides or growing organically, something along those lines. And the reality is we just don't have very good materials to control a lot of these insects in a non-traditional kind of way. There are some biological control materials that are effective. However, you almost have to guarantee the beneficials some small level of whitefly population to be able to survive. And that's not a good strategy with if you're in an area where the viruses would be transmitted. So I think of it more like a zero tolerance, which makes the beneficials really, really tough to do. And this is the challenge. The main virus is tomato yellow leaf curl virus, which is transmitted by the silverleaf whitefly, and it basically just shuts down the top of the plant. If you look on the picture on the left-hand side, the lower leaves look a little bit more normal, and then as it progresses up, we begin to see more severe deformity and yellowing and twisting and sort of contortion of that upper portion of the plant. And so the virus typically moves up the plant to the new growth, and that's why you see the concentration of the symptoms. And once you get to this point, there is no cure, there's no turning back, there's just you're basically done with that plant. You can rogue these plants out as soon as you see a symptom, would be one way to try to help manage it. But this is a pretty serious virus, and those are the two outside pictures. The picture on the center is if you leave the population of whiteflies go too high, you get this irregular ripening, and that's a sort of a different disorder, but it's also triggered and caused by silverleaf whitefly. Thrips would be the other thing that can cause some damage. The upper right-hand side is a picture of what the thrips physical damage from feeding looks like, and oftentimes you'll see this on a lot of different plants, and you see the debris, the black debris there, which is the frass from the feeding of the thrips, and then the little puncture holes that are on the fruit on the lower right-hand side. Both of those are going to be a little bit of a problem, maybe not as serious as the whitefly vectored virus problems, but nonetheless can make the fruit unmarketable. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Wanda, and Wanda's going to cover the rest of the main topics here, and then we can have a discussion at the end.
So hello, everybody. So when we talk about doing hydroponic greenhouse tomatoes, we are growing in soilless substrates. So the reason why we would do that versus soil, greenhouses are permanent structures, so we do not have the option of doing crop rotation. So we're going to be growing the same crop in the same place year after year. So soil is out. The ability to manage soil-borne pests from soil inside greenhouses requires greenhouse fumigation. That is licensing. It is a much harder program to facilitate. So the use of soilless substrates eliminates that need to fumigate the soil. We get better, more uniform control of water and nutrients. These are designed for nutrient uptake in these systems. They have good drainage and therefore better aeration. They do not stay saturated. Your plants can breathe and build a better root system, and better overall soil type properties. They have amendments in them like perlite and things to help better aerate, so that plant can have a better root foundation, and you get higher consistent yields with them. When you use a soil substrate, you know what you're getting, and you're going to be able to build a recipe and a program off of that better than you can in the soil. So some of these substrate-based systems are the Dutch buckets. These are beta buckets. They are a reservoir bottom, and these can be used with a couple of different substrates. They're very versatile. You can use a container multiple times, so your upfront cost will amortize over several years. They're very durable, and they are hard to overwater because they have a reservoir bottom that will overflow in case of overwatering. So you're not going to get saturated. Some of the others are lay flat bags. These can be rock wool, perlite, or coconut fiber. And then there's traditional upright bags, or like 3-gallon nursery pots are a good option. Okay, the reservoir system that we traditionally use, and this is a commercial container for tomato production, is the Dutch bucket, and you can see the side shot that it has a reservoir bottom. Inside the greenhouse, we traditionally use 100% perlite, but there are rock wool forms that you can be used, and as well as coconut fiber, but you got to make sure that it's a well-draining substrate, or they will still get oversaturated at the bottom of these reservoir containers. So some of the options that we have, forgive me, I got to move this over, these are some of the options out. Yeah, fix me. Oh, oops. Hold on, I got to go back. Technical difficulties. So you can see that there's a lot of different soilless substrate options, and these are for many different crops. So sand, gravel, sawdust, crop waste, rice hulls, things like that, peat moss, coconut fiber, perlite, vermiculite, pine bark, oasis cubes, rock wool, and then clay beads, and that's hydrogen clay pellets. We're going to focus on core, perlite, rock wool, and then pine bark, because those are the ones that we're going to use for tomato production. So those are the ones that we're focusing on. The first one up is rock wool. So this is the standard in greenhouse production. This has been used from Europe to Canada, United States, Mexico. It is probably the most common. It does get expensive when fuel prices go up, but it is developed in a way that it has a perfect cation exchange capacity for nutrients and buffering of your nutrient solution. It's got a good air to water holding ratio. It is pricey. And it has to be shipped. It is not biodegradable, so cannot be used in organic production. It needs to be commercially incinerated. So this is not something you can just add to your compost at the end of the season. But it comes in a form that is easy to use and set up, and it is very consistent material. So the next is coconut fiber. And coconut fiber has become very popular, and it is outpacing peat materials because of its sustainability, and it's more in production, where peat bogs, there's some contention over peat bogs, whether it's going to be available in the future. So it also has a excellent water holding capacity and air exchange. It does tend to be a little bit salty, so it has over time been buffered. It also comes in lay flat bags. It comes in pressed blocks, different forms. It's readily available now. Also gets expensive because it does ship from overseas. And it comes in a lot of different forms, whether you're growing tomatoes or peppers or other things. So it's a very versatile product. And it does not dry down and become hydrophobic like peat does. Perlite is very common. It's used as an amendment in a lot of substrates, but overall, it does not change shape. It stays consistent. It has excellent drainage. The flip side of perlite is it does dry down very quickly. So it has some risk to it in case you lose power or you miss an irrigation cycle. Perlite is not as forgiving as some of the other substrates. So once we figure out which substrate we're going to use, we know which greenhouse we're going to use, we've got our crop. Now we have to manage the crop. And this is where it gets really interesting on a day-to-day. Greenhouse tomatoes are a 9-month crop generally. You start sowing seeds in August. You're planting within 5 weeks. You should start setting fruit in about another 120 days. So by Christmas, you are generally starting to pick fruit. And then for the next 9 months, you're rolling on this crop. So you're talking about, you can go to the next one.
Yeah. And I'm gonna just add there that's the system that we're using here, the 9-month continuous crop. It's possible that the winter cost of heating gets to be to the point where people might prefer to have a short fall crop stop and then restart again in the spring. But here, as Wanda mentioned, the standard here is for us to have a 9-month go through the winter.
Okay, so in that production system that we're running, these are high wire tomato. So we are going to use a trellis system. There's also, you'll see later in the presentation that there's a field type of a system, but these are grown particularly in lay flat bags. Some of these trellis systems are in excess of 14 feet high, so you have to have automated scissor lift to get to them. But it adds, you lower and lean less at this rate than you would if you had a short trellis system. So it might be a little bit more cumbersome to get them up, but you'll do a little less lower and leaning this way. So this is what lower and leaning is. So we use a tomato twine with clips that you'll see. And as we train the tomatoes to a single leader, so all of the side shoots come off. And as the vine grows, we use clips to keep it attached to the stem and then attached to a trellis using one type of a roller hook or a clipper system. So there's some different options for devices to lower and lean. We use tomahawks. So every week you pinch it and it lets down roughly 6 inches of line. And so you lower them down and then you lean them over to the side. One side will lower one direction, one side will lower the opposite direction. So you're making a continuous loop for that 9 months, which at the end of it, you'll end up with about a 30-foot tomato vine. So you can see on the left-hand side, everything is coming around a pole or some type of a system to you to make that turn. That turn is where you take a lot of damage. So you have to be very careful in this method of lower and leaning because you can potentially break your stems.
Wonder how long at the end of the season would you typically have a vine?
About 30 feet. Depending on your cultivar. Some of them are more aggressive and tend to be taller, and then some of the old cultivars like Trust they don't grow as aggressively, so they might tend to be a little bit shorter. So you can see the tomahawks that we have at the top. It hooks to a small aircraft cable that we use. When you're setting up your trellis system, you need to make sure that you have a system that can withstand the weight of that amount of plants. It is very heavy. And if you do not have them secured properly, you'll come into an entire line of tomatoes laying on the ground. It does happen quite unfortunately, quite often. So making sure everything is secure and heavy or that can take that weight is very important. So we've got trellis hooks, we've got vine, some people use jute, but we use a polyethylene tomato twine that when it gets wet, we don't have to worry about mold. It will dry off readily, which is an issue if you're using natural fibers, that they can actually exacerbate disease issues if they're not drying down properly. You'll see in the picture on the right, that is a tomato clip. They have little teeth that hold onto that vine. And I left that picture intentionally because that clip is not in position correctly. It should be underneath that leaf and not on top of it. So that clip is intended to not only keep the tomato vine close to the string and keep them straight under management, but it also helps support the weight of that plant.
And the weight of those plants, I know that in sometimes we have 8, 10, 12 pounds per plant times however many you got down the line. And just to reemphasize Wanda's point about there's a lot of weight that cable system has got to support.
Yeah. So not only the cable itself, but some of these stems, some of the hands-on clustered type, the TOVs, have very long stems that come off of them. The weight of the tomato will rip the fruit off of that stem. So you see, you have in the center picture, you have these little vine clips that help protect that stem from kinking and bending over, which will stop them from maturing. You also have what is called a J hook, and you see in the picture on the left that the J hooks have different size hooks on them, so you can move and reposition them in different places depending on what that fruit set itself. But these help keep the fruit attached to the plant, and it helps keep them off of the ground. So every week, and these are things that have to be done and managed on time to get a good crop. And so that is pollination. You have to do it every week. A couple of times a week in that case, sucker removal, and then cluster pruning. And these are usually done very rapidly. You try to time yourself and get it done as efficiently as possible because you could waste a lot of time doing this. So you'll see in the initial you'll see the little flower that is very close to the tomato twine. That fruit cluster needs to be protected at all times. So if you're not winding your tomatoes or clipping them properly, you could essentially knock off your flowers, which is your fruit. So you're just going to grow hedges if you're not careful. The two pictures on the bottom are suckers. So you can see a small sucker in between the leader and the stem, the leaf that comes out. You want to remove those small suckers. You do not want to remove the 2 or 3 that are very closest to the top of the plant, because if you break that main leader, one of those suckers could potentially take its place. But the picture that's in the top right hand corner, if you wait to sucker and those suckers get too big, then you'll have a large wound that is open on the plant that you could potentially get disease. They're harder to remove. They can damage the epidermal layer of the stem itself when you're taking them off. You're usually, if you can catch them small, you can roll them off with your finger. If you wait till they get too big, you'll end up having to cut them off. And using any kind of scissor or tool on your plant is a good way to transmit disease from one plant to another. So anything you could do to minimize will benefit you later. The picture on the left is our cluster pruning. So cluster pruning, you can determine the size of your fruit by how many of those flowers you leave on. So if you want smaller fruit, you can have more fruit per cluster. If you want larger fruit, you take more of the flowers off, but you have to get them off at a very young stage in order for them to kind of predetermine what size they're going to be. If you wait, they're going to, and you want bigger fruit, but you left the extra flowers on too long, you're going to get smaller fruit. So it's important to do your cluster pruning very quickly and early on in the process of fruit set. So pollination, this is something that we have. You see our bumblebee. We do not use honeybees. They use bumblebees. You can buy these in. It will be a constant reorder. So you'll get the boxes in. You'll have them for a few weeks, and then they'll send you a new box. You can close bumblebees into a hive if you have to do any kind of chemical applications. But bumblebees, they're hard workers. They do not come out when it's cloudy or rainy out. So you potentially could lose fruit set, whether by hand or by bee if you're doing it yourself. But if you have too small of a crop and you have bumblebees, they can overwork the flowers and actually damage the flowers. And they'll die if they don't have enough food. So you want to make sure that your plant population and your bumblebees match. Okay. There are some odd things that can happen. The picture in your top right is it's kind of a double bloom on a flower. That could be from the breed or the cultivar, some different things that can happen that cause that. I would expect that flower to later maybe present, if it develops into a fruit, maybe a cat-faced fruit, which you'll see in one of the other photos. But if I was cluster pruning, I may potentially take that flower out because it's not going to give me a marketable fruit in the end. And we did see one cultivar that threw a lot of those misshapen, malformed flowers. The one at the bottom, that could be low light. It could have been cold. It could have been a flower that got damaged by a string, anything but, or it didn't get pollinated on time. So you'll get those flower drops. So you have to be, that's your money. Those flowers are your money. So you need to protect them at all costs.
And that during the winter time, that's when we tend to see a lot of that under the low light period. If there's not enough light to produce viable pollen, they'll abort. So all kinds of interesting things going on in relation to that.
So this is our veggie bee hand pollinator. And if you look closely, you can see the pollen falling out of each of those flowers. That is time consuming. I time myself, I can get pretty fast at it unless I'm staring at the pollen coming out of the flower. You can also use a backpack blower. If you're Bob, you can come through with some kind of a PVC stake or something and just hit the trellises in different spots, something to vibrate those flowers to where they will release the pollen. So tomato flowers are complete. They have all female and male parts. So all they need is that mechanical movement to release pollen, but it needs to be at a time of the day where the pollen is readily available to fall. The petals you see will flip backwards. That's an indication of that flower is ready to release pollen.
And outdoors, we don't have this to worry about because the wind is doing that physical movement. But in the greenhouse, we got to provide either the bumblebees or the manual pollen.
Yeah. And if you don't do it a few times a week, you are not going to have fruit. So there are things that can go wrong very quickly with tomatoes. And one of those, the one on the left-hand side, it looks like a gorgeous plant. It's very happy and green, but I happen to know that we were pushing that plant pretty hard. So at the bottom underneath this, like y'all can't see me, underneath the fruit, underneath the clip, you can see where that stem is very flat and kind of wide. That is from over fertilization. That's too much nitrogen. They're pushing a little too hard. It has a potential to cause the fruit to abort as well. But you don't want that flattening of that stem. Sometimes they'll even flatten to a point where the stem splits right there and you end up with a gap in between. So you want to make sure that you're not pushing your plants too hard where they're too vegetative. If you're overfeeding them, they can also tend to get bullish and the leaves are very heavy. You're going to get a lot of leaves and not a lot of fruit. You're going to get a lot of side shoots, a lot of excess growth off of the fruit clusters. So there's a lot of signs of over fertilizing. But on the flip side, if you are not providing enough nutrient, you can tend to get enough calcium through your plants. You're not controlling your irrigation properly, you will get blossom end rot. Blossom end rot comes from a lack of calcium. Calcium moves through the plant through the water column. So if you're not irrigating enough, even if you have enough calcium, if you're not irrigating enough, you could still end up with blossom end rot. If I walk into a greenhouse and somebody has blossom end rot, I'll say, so did you have a period of dry down? And they'll say, no, I don't think so. But you can see the plants will tell you that that's what happened. And then you can grow right back out of it. So that is something that happens very quickly. It happens when the fruit is developing, and you won't see it later until that fruit expands. It develops a weak spot where the cell walls did not build properly, and that's where you get blossom end rot from. The picture on the end is a cultivar that's that same flower that has that cat-facing appearance to it. Some of the older heirloom varieties, that is just a characteristic that they have, but if you're doing fresh market tomatoes on the vine, that is an unacceptable quality in a plant, in a fruit. So we have different options. So over the years, we've done a lot of different growing methods in different areas. So you're not limited if you don't have a greenhouse to growing greenhouse tomatoes. We have what we call a Florida basket weave system, where you use a string once a week and you go between every plant or every stake and you basically contain the plant between two strings. This is not an easy thing to do. It's a little bit backbreaking and you have miles of string by the end of the season, but that's a field tying method that can be modified to do greenhouse or indeterminate type tomatoes. You could also do field type tomatoes under some shade and they take on more of a greenhouse indeterminate type of a growth pattern. But is a lot of management when you're in these type of a system outdoors. The shade structure in the top right corner, if you overshade tomatoes, even in this outdoor system, you will end up with 6-foot tall hedges and no fruit. So it is very important to get enough light to make sure that you have good fruit set. Or that's a lot of work for no tomatoes.
I think, Wanda, the purpose here is that not everybody's going to have that greenhouse and the long 30-foot long, the capability of having a 30-foot long stem. And so this gives an option of maybe their favorite garden type of tomato, but a determinate type that they would grow maybe just again in the fall and then starting again in the spring. So I think that our purpose here is to just show that we don't have to be stuck with a long indeterminate type or nothing. You've got other options as well.
And finally, if you have, this is a vertigrow system. So this is a vertical tower system using a soilless substrate. This can be used in a commercial setting or a single standalone home hobby system. We use these quite a bit. So I say, if this is your only system, then there are ways of using this to grow tomatoes. You would only utilize a couple of the growing spaces. So you would plant 2 corners of the pot, you would skip a pot, and then you do the opposite corners of another pot. It is difficult because tomatoes, it's about a 10-liter pot. and tomatoes require a lot of irrigation. So you really have to manage the irrigation very carefully on a vertical tower garden. What I did find is that if you're using the dwarf or patio type tomatoes and you have a vertical tower system, they are very suited to this, and you can get a lot more production using your towers if you use a dwarf tomato. So practical considerations. We touched on a lot of things quickly, but we didn't go into any depth. So we really want you to think about these things in particular. Let me move y'all. Oh, let's see. Move me, Bob. Yep. So again, so we're going to go over. So the trellis strong enough to manage a large number of plants, cables that don't allow the plants to slide back and forth. You don't want to lean them over and have them lean back. So you need something. I use a coated cable so the roller hooks don't move. Fertigation, we have a 2-injector system with a timer and multiple start times, especially if in the use of perlite. The less water holding capacity your substrate has, the more often you're going to have to water. So you don't want to have more than 10% leach come out of what you put in. So you're going to manage the water very carefully. You're going to start off by just watching it to see how long it runs, how long it takes it to leach, and then you're going to adjust as the crop progresses. You're going to change your irrigation. And eventually, at a mature tomato, you use roughly about a gallon of nutrient a day. So we talked about weekly pollination multiple times, or the use of bees, which can be expensive. So insect and disease management, you're going to have all your tools in your toolbox before you ever sow a seed for your pest management. So we're going to use pest exclusion. We're going to keep everything clean. We're going to keep weeds away from our growing areas. We're not going to bring strange plants into the greenhouse that may potentially have insects on them already, because once they get into that area, they're hard to control. So we have to keep them out. Airflow is very important. So if you have a greenhouse, you've got the use of horizontal airflow fans that keep the air moving constantly. If I walk into a greenhouse and I see free moisture on a plant, then we know we have major issues and we're going to have disease issues later. So we're going to remove all plant debris, keeping the vines off the ground. Anytime that there's a cut area in a stem where you've pruned, if that touches the ground, that is an open area for disease to get into your plant. So crop maintenance, so that's important. Crop maintenance, daily irrigation checks. We keep one emitter in a container by itself, so I can walk in the door and instantly see whether my irrigation has ran or not. That has saved me multiple times, and I suggest everyone do that. And then you could also use that to test the nutrients that's coming in, and you're also going to catch the leach coming out to make sure that you're not over or under fertilizing your plants. So we have weekly pruning, trellising, scouting. Every time you walk through your crop, you're scouting. And then pollination, and at the end of it's harvesting. So it's a half an hour, so everybody should be expert, right? Right? And then that is what you look like. That's what your clothes look like. That's what your hair looks like. At the end of it, it is not cheaper than therapy, but you do get tomatoes at the end of it. So everybody should grow tomatoes.
All right, that's our presentation on tomatoes. And I know while we were going through this, I saw there was some questions and things on the chat. So Jeremy, we'll turn it back over to you to kind of help us through this.
Yeah, we've got a question that says, given the high labor nature of growing tomatoes in hydroponics, stringing, pruning, etc., what are the economics of that system? Are there markets that support such type of costly production?
Yeah, I think later in the year, Dr. Kevin Athern, our economist here, is going to be talking a little bit more detailed on that. I would say that the thing that you have to be careful for, that this is a very expensive system, and I don't want to even get into the numbers because depending on the size of the operation, the break-even point is going to change pretty dramatically. However, you're going to have to, on a small basis, you're going to have a high-value product that probably is going to be sold locally. It's very difficult to compete at the grocery store marketplace with the other larger operations that are on board there. So can it work? Yes. but you have to be a very good marketer. And I would say that our experience watching farmers who have been successful, you could be a pretty decent average or so grower, but you have to be an excellent marketer. And if you're not an excellent marketer, no matter how good a grower you are, I would say those are the ones that have crashed and burned, and sometimes crash pretty quickly. So sometimes one of my patented stories is that we have people that'll come in and say, "Oh, well, Johnny down on the corner says he'll take every tomato that I can grow in the greenhouse," and I tell them that's exactly what Johnny's going to do. He's going to take them. So that's not the way to think about this. You cannot think about this as an average field price kind of a tomato. This is a very high value kind of a situation. There's a lot of labor, and so I think that it's, as I said at the beginning, you have to be really serious and understand all of what's going to be necessary to be a successful tomato grower. And probably, in all honesty, the other part of that question, I would say we've seen more people fail than succeed because they're not prepared and they think it's going to be an easy way to make a lot of money. And it's the last crop that will do that for you.
Yeah, I agree. And I in Alabama, I know what's bit a lot of folks who get into it was the gas bill. You know, they just couldn't, at least with the yields they were getting, you know, they were having a hard time, you know, breaking even with their gas bill, because it does require a significant amount of heating the farther north you go.
Yeah. And then, Jeremy, I see the comments or questions on the blossom end rot. And yes, it is a calcium uptake problem. And yes, you do get calcium from the calcium nitrate that goes into the plant. But I would say that be careful to assume that calcium nitrate alone is going to take care of blossom end rot. The interesting thing about calcium is, as Wanda mentioned, it's only taken up through the water stream. This is not an active transport across the root tip like potassium and nitrogen are. So if the plants go dry and no water or little water, there's going to be little calcium, even though you're using calcium nitrate. So you cannot run low on water. You can also create a problem by increasing calcium nitrate because there's a lot of nitrogen in that as well, and you can over vegetate, sort of you get an over vegetation, and also helps to reduce the calcium uptake. And a very vigorous plant, and I won't go into this too much detail, there's probably a 30-minute one on it all in itself, but when you have a very vigorous plant, all of the water goes up and through the leaves. There's a lot of transpiration going on there, and not as much calcium gets into the fruit because you're not transpiring as much out of that fruit. So blossom end rot is really a very, very complicated disorder. So the next one there on cat facing, we would agree that something's going on there at the pollination time. And if you get too cold a temperature at night, I would also agree with that you can create situations there with more cat facing.
Yeah, and Helene, you asked about the links for the recording, and I am working on that as we speak. They're uploading, so I'll hopefully have at least one of them sent out today, but they'll all three should be out pretty soon. And I'll send that to your email. Another question: do hide tunnels in greenhouse function similarly in supporting the success of a hydroponic crop or culture?
I'll take a stab and I'll let Wanda, the grower, kind of clean it up a little bit. I would say that, the key word there is similar. Yeah, I think they function similarly, but I think it goes back to what your goals are, and you're gonna need a greenhouse with heating and all of the environmental controls if you're going to try to go for an extended long period of time. A high tunnel typically is going to be a more short duration season. So yeah, they're similar. And then I think maybe embedded in that question is for hydroponic culture. Yeah, you can use hydroponic culture in any of these systems that Wanda's mentioned, either in a tunnel or in a greenhouse. But I think that they both are very different in terms of meeting your marketing goals for a particular crop.
I agree with all of that. The thing, if you were doing crops that are not as cold sensitive, then a high tunnel is the way to go. Or if you're trying to extend into the spring, but they get very hot very quickly, they get very cold very quickly. So if you have a sensitive crop like a tomato, you're still going to have to offer some other type of freeze protection, cold protection, like a frost cloth inside the tunnel to maintain enough to keep the plant alive, not necessarily keep the fruit going, but just to protect the plant itself if you get that cold. So tunnels will keep the rain off of your plants, but outside weather's cold and heat inside can also cause a lot of condensation. So tunnels do have some drawbacks to it. But they're for season extension, essentially.
And I think the tunnels also maybe provide a point of entry if you can't afford, you know, a full-blown greenhouse. You got to, you know, $2 or $3 a square foot versus, you know, 10, 20, 30, 50, whatever bells and whistles you want in a greenhouse. So at some point, you know, if you want to ease into it and learn a little bit, you know, maybe the tunnel for the investment is a good place to start and learn the system, and don't be expecting too much out of the tunnel. That's the other thing that I think a lot of times people put a tunnel in and they're expecting it to perform and give you all of the protection that a greenhouse does. And it's just, that's not the way it goes.
All right, do we have any other questions? Great. Well, thank you, Bob and Wanda. This was very informative, and I think everybody got a lot out of it. And we'll see you guys next month on the third Thursday of the month. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Jeremy.